All right, hello. Welcome to Homework 4A. This is going to be 4.1 through 4.5, I believe. 4.6, something like that. 4.6. So let's go ahead and get started. 4.1 is pretty basic. We're not going to go too in-depth on this one, and it's just more of an introduction to the unit. But basically, 4.1 introduces the core values of America. And so political culture is just the ideas that Americans have. It's a set of attitudes, beliefs, and kind of like sentiments that we have as Americans that give order and meaning to our political process. And so we often disagree with each other on policy because of ideology. We generally agree on core values, which is kind of like our culture. And I think sometimes we don't realize these things because we are Americans, and so we've grown up here and we don't realize that other countries are different. But in America, these are things that generally generally valued by the vast majority of Americans. Number one is individualism. This is the belief that individuals should be responsible for themselves and be as free from government as possible, right? And we've seen this starting in the Declaration of Independence. We've seen this at the very beginning of our country when it was founded, the idea that we shouldn't rely on the government to protect us, we should protect ourselves. The question there, of course, is there's tension about how much the government should intervene to help the individual. Next is equality of opportunity. So this is the idea that we should have a level playing field. Everyone should have the same chance to succeed and not be limited by things like that we can't control, like race, gender, things like that. This is different than equality of outcome. So we're not necessarily saying that everyone will get the same thing in the end, like a job or money or whatever, but everyone is entitled to a fair start, not necessarily a guaranteed equal finish. So that's kind of the difference there. Next up is free enterprise. We learned about this last semester in economics, but it's basically capitalism. It's an economic system in which private businesses operate in competition, free of government intervention and state control. So again, also called capitalism, laissez-faire, invisible hand. The question there, of course, that tension arises when we ask how much regulation is too much, right? So environmental laws can limit business growth, but at the same time, long term, we have to have some kind of regulations on what businesses can do in terms of like dumping trash into rivers, right? So it's that balance there that kind of comes into question. Next up is rule of law. This is pretty basic. It's just the idea that the law applies to everyone, even the government, and this prevents tyranny. And then last is limited government. That's just the idea that the government's powers are limited and defined by the Constitution. It can only do the things that are given to it in the Constitution. This is going to be rooted in Federalist 10, which is the division of factions, and just the idea of like that those factions limiting the power of the government. Federalist 51, separation of powers, and then of course the Bill of Rights. And then that brings us to 4.2, a little bit of a change of pace. Political socialization. We talked about this in class the other day. Political socialization is the process by which people acquire their political beliefs and values. It is a lifelong process, but it is most intense or quick or like influential during childhood and young adulthood. Statistically speaking, the political socialization you experience between 18 and 24 defines your political beliefs for the rest of your life. That's not to say everyone, of course, but the average person decides their political beliefs by 24 and will statistically more than likely not change them through the rest of their life. There are 5 main influences on political socialization. So I kind of condensed those down into 3. I kind of combined some. Number 1 is family, and this is the number 1 agent. Okay, primary agent for political socialization is family, and you need to know that. There is about a 70% likelihood that if you are raised by Republicans, you will vote Republican, and then, of course, the same is true for Democrats. There's a 70% likelihood that you will vote Democrat if you were raised by Democrats. And so this is for 2 main reasons. Number 1, the way you're raised is to listen to the things your parents say, and generally children accept the things their parents say as truth, and that's for a reason, right? Parents are there to keep you safe and to keep you fed and warm, and so because you have a trust in them in terms of physical safety as well as an emotional connection to your parents, you are going to generally trust the things they say. However, and then on the other hand, in addition to that, right, not only are you going to believe the things they say in terms of specific issues like gun control, but also they are going to raise you with values that match their political party. So, for example, if your parents are Democrats, they probably are more likely to believe in collectivism over individualism, right? Conversely, if your parents are Republicans, they're more likely to believe in individualism over collectivism. And that's, again, generalizations, right? Not always and not every, but as a statistical overgeneralization, right? So if your parents are, let's say, Republicans, they will probably raise you with that value of individualism, hard work, merit-based society, free enterprise, things like that, right? And so if you're raised with those values, of course, then you are going to choose a party that aligns with those values, and it's a continuous cycle. So it makes complete sense. The next one is going to be education and school. So those kind of go together, of course. Education level obviously is different from the school you go to. So let's start with education level. As education level rises, the more likely you are to vote Democrat, and as your education level, if your education level is lower, you are more likely to vote Republican. Again, not necessarily a reflection on like your intelligence. That's not what we're talking about here. And there's actually a lot of mixed research on IQ and political party affiliation. We're just talking about education level, like the level of education. So secondary, meaning high school, versus post-secondary education, like college and beyond. And then the school you go to, of course, has an influence on you as well. And so if you go to, Harvard, which is a pretty liberal institution, you might get a different education and therefore a different political socialization than if you went to Liberty University or BYU, which are more conservative institutions. Okay. And then number 3 is peers. Peers, obviously, the friends you make are going to influence you. And so we kind of get into these echo chambers of peer groups, friends, coworkers. They are going to start to maybe challenge, but probably reinforce those family taught beliefs because, birds of a feather flock together. I'm sure you've heard that saying. You're more likely to make friends who agree with you. And then media is going to be what you watch, obviously. Obviously, if you're a conservative, you're more likely to watch Fox News, versus if you're liberal, you're more likely to watch something like MS Now. And social media obviously is more relevant here, where your algorithm will adapt itself to your perspective. And so if you are conservative, you're going to start to see a lot of conservative pundits and media and social media posts and influencers, right? Whereas if you are more on the left, you're going to start to see those kind of perspectives. And then last thing is organizations, religious groups, social justice groups, community groups, those kind of things might influence you. Okay. And then that brings us to 4.3 through 4.4. And so this is going to be changes in ideology. So these are things that can change how we believe, ideologically speaking and politically speaking. Now, remember how I said that political socialization mostly occurs 18 to 24. That's not to say that you will never shift your political beliefs. It's just that those core values are going to start to emerge at that time. And so 4.3 through 4.4 focuses on things that will change how you believe politically. Number 1 is the life cycle effect. Young adulthood, middle age, and then your senior years are going to change what is important to you, right? So when you're a young adult, things like education, student loans, social justice, climate change, things like that are going to be more important to you. And so you're more likely to vote for a party that aligns with those things. And so that's why the Democratic Party has a larger young adult, 18 to 24-year-old voting base than the Republican Party. Whereas in middle age, you're going to start to be a lot more impacted by economic things, specifically large-scale economic things, taxes, investments, interest rates, school funding. And so a stable economy is going to be very important to you. And so middle-aged people tend to be more likely, statistically speaking, to vote for Republicans, in part because of those key issues on their platform. And then in your senior years, actually, it's like a 50-50 split. Some people become a lot more conservative in their older years, and then some people become a lot more liberal in their older years. And there's a few reasons for that, but it's mostly to do with the things that are important to you. So things like Social Security, Medicare, healthcare costs, those things are going to start to come to light in your older age, and whoever party is going to appeal to those issues is going to get the senior vote. Then you have generational effects. And so when we talk about generations, a lot of times we're looking at age cohorts, so millennials versus boomers, right? But keep in mind, again, 18 to 24 is that formative age. And so events during those years leave this big imprint on political identity. So for example, people who were 18 to 24 years old during 9/11 are generally, statistically speaking, have a much more anti-war stance than people who were children at that time, small children, or people who were older adults at that time. Because again, that formative age, if you were 18 to 24 in 2001, you are much more likely to have been majorly impacted by that event, politically speaking. Another example is going to be the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So a lot of debates over federal versus state power, public health, those kind of things start to emerge. And then political events, and so things like the Great Depression, that's what we were just talking about, right? The Great Depression and then Vietnam and Watergate led to a long-term decline in trust in the government. Okay, that brings us to 4.5. 4.5 is the science of polling. So public opinion. What is public opinion? First of all, this is what the public thinks, right? Do we support same-sex marriage? Do we want to raise taxes? Do we believe in public education? Now, some people might ask, why do we care? Why do we need to know what the public wants? Okay, and there's a few different reasons for that. But first of all, political efficacy comes to the forefront here. Political efficacy is the belief that one's political participation matters. And when political efficacy is high, voting registration and participation increases, as well as just civic engagement in general. So writing your senator, volunteering, all the things that make you a good community member participating in your community. And then when we use these polls, we are able to then fine-tune our platforms to be able to personalize a campaign, right? So for example, President Trump, when he was running his political campaign, relied on poll data from Republicans who made it very clear in terms of their polls that they believed that the economy was the number one issue. And statistically speaking, in 2024, the economy was the number one issue by far in the public. That was like the one thing everyone was very, very worried about because inflation was very, very high. And so President Trump ran on the economy platform. He said prices were going to go down, we're going to lower taxes, maybe we'll do a stimulus, right? Which was very, very popular, as opposed to Kamala Harris, who tended to have more of a social platform. Now, it's not to say that people do not care about social platforms, right? But because the economy was the number one issue in terms of polling, and President Trump ran on the economy, that is in part potentially why he won the 2024 election. And now, if Vice President Harris had run on the economy, would she have won? I don't know. I really don't. But that is definitely something we use public opinion for, is to kind of steer those political campaigns and kind of try to get to the heart of what the public wants. Now, there are four main things that you need to know about scientific polls, 4 elements. Number one is a random sample. These are things that make a scientific poll more accurate, more high quality, and more useful for politics. A random sample is the idea that every individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected. We are going to talk in just a minute of what happens when you don't have a random sample. But basically, this is the idea that the average person should be able to be selected. It shouldn't be just women or just white people or just 40 to 45-year-olds, unless that's really what you're looking at. But generally speaking, you want a random sample because the average voter is not any of those things. Or they might be, but might not be, right? We want to look at everyone. And that brings us to number 2, representative sample. So if we have a group of 100 people, if we take a random sample, which means we pick those 100 people randomly, we're not having any kind of bias, we're not trying to pick people who look like us or our friends, right? That sample should mirror the demographics of the population. So it should be, if there's 100 people in the group, about 50 women and 50 men. It should be about 48 white people and then 15 black people and 15 Hispanic people, and then 20 people of other races, so Asian people, indigenous people, right? Some kind of combination thereof. And so that would be a random sample, or a representative sample, meaning it represents the demographics of the population. Now, again, if we're looking in Texas, for example, that representative sample might look a little different. It might be more Hispanic people, because in Texas we tend to have more Hispanic voters. But it should mirror the demographics of the population. Sample size. I said 100 earlier. That is way too small of a poll. We want a much bigger sample size, because the more people you poll, the more valuable that information is, and the less one specific person being an outlier can impact your data. And then margin of error. Margin of error, an acceptable margin of error is about 3%, which is why when there's a really tight race, for example, President Trump and Vice President Harris, when they were running in 2024, public opinion polls showed Vice President Harris at like 49% of the vote, President Trump at 48% of the vote, and then the other runners at like 3% or whatever, right? Well, people freaked out after the election of, well, Vice President Harris was winning, right? But an acceptable margin of error is about plus or minus 3%. And so if we are within that plus or minus 3%, it's considered an accurate poll. And it might not show up in that representative or random sample within that 3%, right? On either side. Now, if the polls had showed 10% for, Vice President Harris was polling 10 points up, and then she had lost, that would be a little bit more confusing, and that probably wouldn't have been a very good poll. But within like 3% is considered an acceptable margin of error. All right, and then there are technically five types of polls that you need to know. This is almost always on the AP exam. You have to know these, and you have to know the difference between them. Benchmark, tracking, entrance, exit, mass surveys, focus groups. Okay, let's start with benchmark. Benchmark polls are taken at the start of a campaign to gauge initial support. Tracking polls are daily or weekly polls. We also call these horse race polls, which means that we are watching the statistics change as the days and weeks go on, so that we can see what impacts things. Entrance exit polls are conducted on election day. Okay, so benchmark is way before, at the very beginning of the benchmark, or very beginning of the campaign, Tracking is as you go, and then entrance exit is on election day. Entrance polls are when they're going in, exit polls are when they're going out. We'll talk about the difference between those two in class. And then mass surveys are going to be quantitative data, so huge numbers, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, versus focus groups. Focus groups are 10, 20 people max. This is going to be qualitative data. So on a mass survey, they're going to be asking you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to vote for this person, right? Or would you rather vote for Trump or Harris, right? It's not going to be necessarily your opinions in depth. Focus groups are where they sit down with a small group of people and really interview them on their opinions. Okay. All right, last one is going to be where polls go wrong. So first, let's start with errors. You need to know these two. Number one is sampling errors. So, for example, if we are polling people, but we only choose people we know, statistically speaking, we're most likely to make friends with people who look like us, right? Most of my friends are women, for example. So if I only polled my friends, the data would be skewed in favor of what women think versus what men think, right? Also, most of my friends are my age, so we're mostly going to be getting 30-somethings versus children or older adults, right? The other thing is, sometimes this is intentional, right? Like, that, I really could have seen that coming pretty easily by just polling my friends. That doesn't really make any sense. But what if I did a survey and I only called landline phones? I'm sorry, I haven't answered my phone in like 2 years. I just let it go to voicemail. I don't answer that thing. I think most people who are millennials and Gen Z are going to agree with me on that. So the average person who answers the phone, especially a landline, is going to be at least a Gen X, if not a boomer. And so you're only going to be sampling older adults in that time versus younger adults, and you're going to unintentionally oversample older people. All right. Or let's say you did a poll online, but you did it on Fox News's front page. Probably the average person who takes that survey is going to skew towards conservative, right? Because the average Democrat is probably not reading Fox News on a daily basis. Then you get push polls. Push polls are designed to do this and intentionally make errors. they're designed to manipulate opinions. And so usually this is taking the form of a loaded question. For example, do you support taking criminals off our streets by locking them up and not letting them attack our children? Who's going to say no to that, right? That would just be crazy. But what they're trying to do is show that, oh, everybody agrees with us, and use that public opinion data not necessarily to shape their campaign, but to support their opinion. And then you have the Bradley effect, also known as the social desirability bias. This is the idea that respondents tend to give like politically correct opinions rather than their actual opinion. And so if they think that the pollster or the person polling them is going to judge them, they won't actually tell the truth. They'll lie. For example, if you had, when statistically speaking, it's very hard to tell in America how many people are, for example, racist, because the average person is not going to tell you that they are racist, or they might not even think that about themselves. But if it's an anonymous survey, you're actually much more likely to get realistic data. A good example of this is when you poll people in relationships about domestic violence. If you ask someone outright to their face, have you ever committed domestic violence? They're almost always going to tell you no. But when you ask people anonymously, have you ever hit your partner after a disagreement? They're much more likely to say yes. And so there is some social desirability bias, meaning people are not going to probably give you the truth necessarily if they think that they're going to be judged. So you have to make sure that you account for that in what you're asking and how you're asking it. Okay. And so how does this impact people? Number one, it can actually impact how the government acts. People disagree on how much, but governments do, generally speaking, listen to their constituents. Whether or not this actually impacts how they act, people disagree on that, but just remember, we talked about this at the beginning of the class, the delegate model versus the trustee model. If a representative, like a congressperson, is acting within the delegate model, this is where they act based on public opinion. And so they are going to look at polls and say, okay, 80% of my constituents want to lower taxes. Well, I'll write a bill then to lower taxes. Sounds great. Versus the trustee model, remember, that's where they act on their own judgment versus even if it contradicts with the public. And then, of course, the media uses polling, of course, to influence and their reporting, who's winning, kind of thinking of it as like a horse race versus the actual political stances of the candidates. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and stop there, and we will pick up with 4.7 later on. Bye.